Session today. So this is the Inequality Policy and the Economy session. We're going to be having 3 presentations. So it'll be myself, Haris, and then Adeel, who will be joining us shortly, who's in the other room right now. So we'll get started with the first presentation, and then Adeel can join, and then he'll take over from there. Okay. All right. So. All right, so let me get started and formally introduce myself. So my name is Obeid Rehman, and the paper I'm going to be presenting talks about the role of taxes and transfers in reducing inequality, specifically looking at the context of Pakistan. So this is joint work with Mazhar Wasim, who's at Manchester, and Zara Farouk, who's a PhD candidate at Tulane. So today I'm going to be presenting some preliminary results that we have. This is actually the first time we're presenting these results, so I'm very eager to receive any comments and feedback that you have about it. So we have some preliminary results, which, as you'll see, I think are particularly interesting, and we have sort of a roadmap of where we want to move forward with this project. So to start off with, the topic of the project is income inequality, and the issues regarding inequality, I think, for this audience in particular, are fairly well understood. I'll highlight that in terms of the trends in inequality, what we've seen globally is that over the last few decades, it's been increasing. So across different countries, using different metrics, we now have data that shows that inequality has increased. Right? So in terms of some numbers, this paper by Chancellor et al. Shows that globally, the share of the richest 10% has now grown to 60% of total income, while the share of the bottom 50% of individuals has shrunk to less than 10%. This is a global phenomenon. We have better data from developed economies, but the limited data we do have from developing countries suggests that this issue is even starker in developing economies. So Piketty and co-authors with work in India show that in terms of the trend of increasing inequality, in India, the richest 1% went from having around only 6% of national income in the 80s to having around 22% of national income in the space of just 3 decades. Right? So as was highlighted in a number of sessions, particularly the very informative talk by Dr. Pasha yesterday about, the inequality is negative in its own sense because it sort of undermines social cohesion and it makes governance difficult as it is. And we also have evidence that it stifles economic growth. Right? So as a result of this, public policy is often employed to address this inequality. And this is employed in sort of 2 broad definitions. Right? The first is we generally refer to as redistribution, but conceptually this is thinking about addressing inequality sort of after there's some baseline inequality in income. So what we like to say, this is a post-tax measure. So after you have some inequality in income, you introduce taxes and transfers to reduce that inequality. So that's our classic definition of redistribution. A related and important concept is predistribution. Right? So this is spending, particularly on health and education, to ensure that the distribution of incomes to begin with is more equal. Right? And looking at both of these paradigms is important, right? And I think this is highlighted nicely particularly when looking at policies in this quote from Keene and Slemrod, where they talk about a particular policy, in this case, the VAT tax, right? And just looking at it in terms of a redistribution perspective, VAT comes across as a not very progressive tax. But if that income that it's then generating is being used in a way that can do more for the poor, then in terms of our idea of predistribution, it can achieve reduction in inequality. Right? So when we're judging these policies, when we're judging these tax instruments, it's also important to keep in mind not just how the redistribution is happening, but in terms of revenue generation, where that revenue is going. Right? So with this setup, this raises a lot of important empirical questions about the effectiveness of these policies in reducing inequality. Right? And so on the slide here, I have some of the big picture questions that are being asked. How much redistribution can progressive income taxes actually reduce? VAT or sales taxes are here. They're consumption taxes, but how regressive are they? Can they be in certain settings progressive? What about presumptive taxes, very common here in Pakistan as well? How are they affecting the inequality levels? Right? The challenge that we've had in answering these questions is that they require rich data from a variety of sources. Because inequality at its core, we're thinking about studying the tails of the income distribution. So you want to have data on the very rich, you want to have data on the ultra poor. And so that's why the evidence, particularly from developing countries, has been limited on what the trend has been. So that is the space in which we bring this project forward, and we say that let's try to create a rich data set to answer these questions, right? So what we're trying to do is combine various data sources. Our primary sources are going to be tax data. We're going to look at two of the main tax instruments, which is income tax and the sales tax, or which is the value-added tax. On top of that, we want to overlay that with nationally representative household survey. So we are trying to use the PSLM data because that captures some portion of the population better. So that addresses the taxes situation. We also want to bring in these other elements of public policy to address inequality, so transfers and public spending. And our hope is to address three questions based on this. First is documenting the long-run trends on the dynamics of income inequality. Secondly, examining how much redistribution taxes and transfers achieve in practice. And then thirdly, looking at how much pre-distribution public spending on education and health are able to achieve. So today what I'll be able to show you is some results on the first and second question over here about what are the long-run trends and how much redistribution the income tax system specifically is being able to achieve. Right? So in the interest of time, I'll mention this quickly. This work is related to a range of literature which goes back, as the earliest citation we have is Kuznets when thinking about how the evolution of inequality changes, to more recent work that has again highlighted the role of the tax and transfer systems in either mitigating inequality or, unfortunately, in a lot of documented cases, exacerbating inequality. So before the details, here's a preview of what we found so far. So first, when we look at the tax data, we find very high levels of inequality. So within the tax data, we find that the richest 1% of taxpayers account for around 37% of total income reported in the tax data. This share over this time span between 2009 to 2020 is fairly stable, and I'll show you there are short-run fluctuations, but I think it's difficult to say if there's an observable trend. There's some signs that there might be a negative trend of decreasing inequality, but as you'll see, it's not very pronounced. In terms of redistribution, we start off in income tax with a fairly progressive tax system where tax rates increase with income. And we have large exemption thresholds, so only the richest 10% of the population fall into the category where they actually have to pay income tax. So at first glance, the income tax system comes across as very progressive. However, when we incorporate presumptive taxes, of which for some we have data, we see that the relationship completely flips. And in fact, it becomes U-shaped, where the highest effective tax rates are being paid by either the lowest income percentiles and the highest income percentiles. And then we also look at the spatial distribution about where income is being generated and taxes are being collected. So those are the results we'll present today. And then moving forward, what we want to do is, right now we've done this work on income tax. We want to incorporate the VAT transfers and then also public spending into the equation. So with that introduction, let me briefly give you some context of the data that we're using before getting into the results, which will hopefully be the bulk of my talk. All right, so in terms of the tax data, we're using the universe of tax returns for individuals, firms, and partnerships for a period of 2008 to 2020. Within this data, we have the variables required to calculate tax liability. In addition, we have some data on random audits conducted by the FBR and their results of these audits. This is useful because this might help us to get at tax evasion measures, which is important when we're using tax data to actually judge what true incomes are. Similarly, for VAT, we look at administrative VAT data with monthly tax returns, again for the same panel from 2008 to 2020. So we supplement this with household surveys. So we're using the PSLM. Particularly, we are using waves which have data representative at the district level because we want to map some of these outcomes at the district level. So right now, we're using these 5 waves of the survey. In the future, what we want to do is we also want to incorporate transfer data from BISP. Again, we've had access to the aggregated transfer data at a district level of the conditional and unconditional cash transfers, as well as public spending through the PSD program from federal budget, so incorporating taxes and transfers into our analysis as well. All right, so before the results, I just want to mention, I think this, this audience would be familiar with this, but some of the key points of the income tax system that are relevant for the results that we find, right? So as I mentioned, we have high exemption thresholds in income tax. They're built in. They have been changing over time. They've been increasing. They're not directly tied to the inflation rate, but they have been increasing, right? So for the period of our data, the income tax exemption was around 400,000, 4 lakh. It was shifting. This is now at 6 lakh, so about 50,000 per month is the threshold below which you don't have to pay income tax. And on top of this, there's a progressive rate structure. So rates then start from here and then continue increasing. The maximal rate, again, has been around 35%, again, varying between the different years that we study. Related to this is that we have 2 parallel tax schedules running based on what your primary source of income is, whether you're identified as an employee or self-employed. And this distinction is also made based on where your majority of your income is coming from. So you could be active in both these avenues, but depending on where your majority of your revenue is coming from, that's the tax schedule that's going to be assigned to you. Again, in our time period, the cutoff was at 50%, and now I think the FBR has changed it to 75%. The final and important point here is on presumptive taxes. So some presumptive taxes we can capture in the tax return data. Specifically, these are what the FBR calls as fixed and final taxes. So these are taxes that are withheld at source, but they're not adjustable against any other tax that you have to pay. Right? So in sort of tax speak, they're referred to as the final discharge of liability. So these are presumptive taxes. The idea is that the income generated from these transactions are being captured in the tax net by these presumptive taxes. In the tax return data that we have, individuals report how much fixed final taxes they have paid. They don't, however, report how much the income associated with those transactions are, because usually the fixed final tax are on other measures, usually on revenue or value of some sort. So one thing we have to do is we have to make certain assumptions to go from how much fixed and final tax an individual is paying to how much income that corresponds to. All right, so let me show you sort of our initial results. First is in terms of income inequality in this time span. So we're using, again, our data is the universe of tax returns from 2009 to 2020. Our income measure is what we refer to as full income, so it includes income. It includes income from pass-through sources. If you're a part of a partnership or you're a sole proprietor, that income is included as well. And we also include our imputed fixed and final income. So we know how much fixed final tax you've already paid. From that, we have to somehow impute what your income is. We use, in the versions that I'm presenting, the assumption that this tax was paid at a rate of 20% on that income. For robustness, we've looked at different measures as well, assuming that this was paid at a rate of 30% or 10%. The result seems similar to that. So from this, we drop individuals that report zero total income, and then within the population of taxpayers, we calculate the income percentiles. Right? And now what we do is we calculate the income share of each of these percentile groups. So how much of this total income reported each of these groups is showing. Right? So here's our first result. Again, on the y-axis, we have the income share, and we're showing this for the top 1% of taxpayers, 10%, and top 50%. And so the main result that I mentioned initially, you can see over here that the top 1% of income taxpayers account for around about 36, 37% of total income that's reported in tax return data. When you take this to the top 10%, it rises to around 60-something%. And even within the population of taxpayers, which, the highlight is that this is, again, a very select group, which we expect to be amongst the highest income distribution within the country to begin with. Even within those, the top 50% represent about 90% of all income that's being reported in the tax return data. Yeah. In terms of trends, as you can see, I think it's hard to say if there's any trend. I think our general thinking right now is that there's hard to predict if there's an increase or decrease. One way we can do is for each of these, we can zoom in to sort of see what these movements look like. So these are the same graphs, but now the y-axis, we've sort of zoomed in to sort of see what's happening. And there are fluctuations happening, right? So this is not going to be a fast-moving variable. This is something where we expect even a small percentage point change to be important. So here's what the top 1% and 10% look like. I think it's interesting that they follow a very similar pattern, which is showing that whatever movement is happening in the top 1%. The 10% includes them, so it's capturing the same thing over again, right? So any movement that's coming is coming from the top 1% of taxpayers. The top 50%, this is some indication that inequality may be, at least for the bottom 50%, may be reducing, right? So the top 50% income share has gone down slightly. So if it's not in the top 50%, it means going to the bottom 50%, right? So that's why these lines decreasing would highlight reducing inequality. Yeah. So that's what the trends look like. I think these are much significantly higher. Also, particularly considering the fact that these are individuals that are generally we perceive this population as coming from the top end of the income distribution. We can also calculate the Gini coefficient for within the tax data, what that looks like. And so that is what this graph is. Again, we might say that there might be like a downward trend. Clearly, there was a downward trend up till 2018, but after that, with the COVID pandemic, we seem to be seeing in the last 2 years of data that we have a rise in inequality as well. So maybe a modest decline overall. I'll mention that these Gini coefficients are, again, much higher than coefficients that you find from survey data. So in the PSLM, if you calculate the Gini, you'll get estimates about 0.4, 0.45. In the tax data, we find the Gini coefficient much higher. Again, evidence of much higher inequality within the tax data, coefficients as high as 0.7 in this case. So on top of this, so this is what sort of the tax data shows us. Let's talk about the income tax system as well, about how progressive or not it is. Again, for this, we use our same tax return data. We have our income and corresponding tax definitions. For here, what I'll show you is I'll layer on these tax definitions one at a time to sort of disentangle what part of the income tax is doing what in terms of progressivity. And what we also wanted to do was we wanted to look at categories in terms of the population, not just within the tax data. So for here, what we did was we used the PSLM survey to calculate income percentiles based on household income, to kind of figure out where in the full distribution of households these individuals are. And for them, then we plot the average tax rate, right, which is just the aggregate tax divided by the aggregate income for that group. So I'll show you a series of graphs that look like this. Each of the 4 panels is showing the same thing, it's just different years. We didn't want to have too many lines on the same graph, so it's the same thing, different years, 8 to 10, 11, 13, and so on. On the x-axis, we have the income percentile. So these are deciles, they're not very clear, but they're deciles going up to 90, and then it's the 95th, 99th, and the 99.9th percentile of the income distribution. Again, these percentiles are coming from the PSLM data for that relevant year. Okay? So we start off just with including the progressive income tax schedule, what that's doing, right? So what we see is first that what we were talking about, that income tax is only affecting the top, the normal income tax is only affecting the very top end of the income distribution. Right? Exemption thresholds are high enough that for most of the period, the effective tax rate for anyone below the 90th percentile is 0. It's only after that they kick in, and we see once they do kick in, they are sort of progressive, they're increasing as we go into the 95th percentile. Right? So that's kind of the standard message of, yes, we have increasing marginal tax rates. It becomes more interesting when we add some pass-through income, right? So this is income from partnerships. Partnerships, again, taxed differently. In the earlier time periods, under different rules, we lost some progressivity over here, but more or less, the pictures still look relatively simple. Right? If you look at this, the highlight is this sort of increase that comes in right at the end of the effective tax rate. And then when we add these presumptive taxes, the fixed and final tax, that's where the relationship changes, right? So now when we add that income in, we see that now it's more of a U-shaped, right? So we have low-income individuals paying high tax rates, and then we have high-income individuals paying high tax rates. I will mention as well that the 99.9 percentile, the effective tax rate here is about, it's not labeled, it's about 18%. So, a headline figure of 35% is noticeable. When we actually calculate how much they're actually paying, it comes out to around, 18%. So, based on what your preferences are on how high the highest tax rates are, you might think that that's not high enough. And so this is total income again, right? Finally, we look at the spatial distribution, again, using tax data to map individuals to their cities and then those cities to those districts. We show two measures. One is just the aggregate, and then we again use PSLM household level weights to look at sort of per household level some of these indicators. So here's what using the tax data, the income distribution by district looks like. So again, I think we were expecting concentration in northern Punjab, other concentration in metropolitan areas. So you see Karachi over here, maybe parts of Balochistan also showing up interestingly. And then on the right, we have it per household. So with PSLM, there's some missing districts in certain years. That's why you see some of this is more missing data. But I think the general sort of trend stays the same. So it's not that much different when you look at it in terms of per household level. So this is the income, and then this is correspondingly for the tax as well. It's very similar patterns, again, fairly concentrated in certain districts, particularly in northern Punjab and then in metropolitan areas of the other provinces. So that's what the tax system is. The last thing that I'll mention is this tax system reducing inequality in any way? So we have high levels of inequality. We have a tax system that has this U shape. Is it achieving any reduction in inequality? So a couple of things to look at that. One way is to map net income. So the previous graph was looking at income before tax. Let's look at what happens income after tax. Does it affect spatial distribution of inequality in any way? Headline is no, it doesn't seem to be affecting it. The distribution is still pretty skewed as we saw before. Okay? So no spatial change. We can also look at these income shares of these top earners and say, do those change when we look at net income? Right? So the dashed lines are what I showed you before. The dotted lines then are net income now. So for each income group, if you look at net income, how much share do they have? There's some redistribution. So each income share is now lower. That's when you see with lower inequality, but not by that much. And it seems to be pretty standard sort of throughout this timeline, right? So again, if we zoom in again, we see sort of the differences between gross and net income. There is some redistribution happening. Again, if income is going away from the top 1%, that means it's going to the bottom 99%, so to speak. So some redistribution, but very modest. And then we can also do this for the Gini. So we've calculated the Gini for gross income. We can look at it for net income as well. Again, we find some redistribution, but still, even the net income Gini of 0.66 is very high. Like I said, if you look at survey data, you get coefficients about 0.44. So those are the results right now. As I mentioned in the beginning, what we're hoping to do is add to this the other main tax instrument, which is VAT, which we see as the sales tax, and then transfers and public spending data onto it as well. So I'll stop here, and we'll have the discussion now. Thank you so much.
Am I audible? All right. Thank you so much, Obeid. It was a good, wonderful presentation. Of course, as discussant, my job is also to summarize a little, so it's a quick summary. So basically, this paper plans to show the impact of taxes and redistributive spending on income inequality in Pakistan from 2009 to 2020. For the audience, there's a quick summary. I think it will be very helpful. So Obeid tries to look at 4 dimensions of it. One is the evolution of income inequality across time using Gini and the top shares, 1, 10, and 50%. And then the progressiveness of tax system, if there's any, using the average tax rates and the income broken down on a decile basis. And third, he tries to look at the spatial distribution at the district level using tax data and hopefully later down the road using VAT and other data, PSDP data. And then lastly, the extent of income inequality reduction, if there's any, using pre and post information of taxation and later down the road, hopefully using VAT and public sector spending. So this is, I mean, of course, as he already pointed out, that it is in a preliminary stage. It's hard to say if the paper makes a case. But first of all, I would really like to congratulate you on the choice of topic. It's a very interesting topic. I have been wanting to work on something like this, but I've already babysitting a lot of papers. So I don't want to do, I mean, I can't do it right now, but this is a very interesting topic, and I'm going to be staying tuned to this. Because, as you have already pointed out, that there's not much research on the developing countries, especially the undocumented countries. A lot of international research is on countries mostly developed, where there is a lot of administrative text data available. And now in the developing, India has been recording since 1920 to now. They have been recording administrative text data, so that data is available to Piketty that you pointed out. That's why they have that numbers. But it's very wonderful that you're working on Pakistan's data. I would like to actually understand, first of all, you mentioned it in your paper that you have incorporated the PSLM information into the tax returns information. I would like to understand that a little bit after I'm done with my comments. Because tax data that has been recorded in Pakistan is, I don't know if it's very representative. I mean, I remember, I was looking at some numbers, and there was a website really celebrating that the active taxpayer list has reached 4.66 million of taxpayers. I mean, a population of around 241.49 million in Pakistan, and 60% of them are from 15 to 64 years of age, right? And then if you just take 2/3 of it to be in the workforce, and if you still use the 4.66 million to divide it by the amount that you can fetch from the workforce, it's still less than 5% of the people of the population that are actually paying taxes. Now, there is still a case that you can make that this tax return data maps to the population if you can show your descriptive statistics and some other statistical information to show that this tax return data is a random sample from the population, and it represents the whole population. So maybe you can use the district level and the spatial information, and you can probably show the demographics of the population and how it is a good mapping from tax return data to the population. And of course, I'm interested to understand how you are incorporating the PSLM data to actually extend beyond tax return data to the population. That's something I could not find in the paper, and I was hoping that you would be able to put light on that. And so this is one thing. Secondly, so of course, the paper's strength, which I am actually looking forward to later down the road, which you're inshallah going to work on, is on the data that is available outside the realm of tax administrative data, which is not. So, for example, consumption data that you are looking at, or the VAT data, or the PSDP, the public sector projects that you are thinking of. Because, I mean, let's be honest, since you're working on a micro level data in Pakistan, we can be contextual. The level of corruption in Pakistan, just because you are fetching some taxes from a population, whatever that amount is, does not mean it is translating into the welfare of the poor people. So for example, you show that there is a fetching from top 1%, top 20%, top 50%, but if you look at the political agents in Pakistan, they are mostly from the elite. So if this tax income is confiscated, it is not necessarily going to the poor, right? So just because we can see some decrease, and it's a very parallel decrease from pre and post, which is of course because you're deducting a certain percentage of tax return, that's why the shift is there, but that does not mean it is going to the poor. So you need to really work on how it is translating into the public sector projects. And you know, the kind of rich data that you have, which is the district level data, you can actually look at how it is translating into the differences in income inequality at the regional level. So Hafiz Pasha was there and he was showing some numbers yesterday about the per capita GDP distribution at the regional level. And I told him that per capita GDP is not a representative because we need to have a more income inequality representing information. And you have that data, you can work on that. So this is something you can do. And the kind of work that you're looking in, Dr. Abid Aman Barki has been doing really fundamental work on using the consumption data and all. I've been in his presentation yesterday, and there's so much to learn from him in terms of your work. And you talk about pre-distribution in your presentation, and then later in your presentation, I don't remember the slide number, but you say that it's counterfactual and it's very difficult to actually measure it. So I was really hoping to know how are you going to measure it, and how are you going to utilize, because there's a concept of pre-distribution that you want to play around in your paper. I mean, you can always work on redistribution, but I would really like to know how are you planning to work on pre-distribution, because you haven't worked on it yet. So this is something. And yeah, and then you pointed out that your numbers of Gini and other shares is drastically different from the international numbers. You know, this could be a sign that your data has a selection bias, because those people who are paying the taxes are forced to pay taxes, and those who can get away with it, they get away with it, right? So those who are reporting, they are mainly reporting fake numbers. So this is something you can really work on. But at the end of the day, I would really like to, I'll be very happy that you'll work on that, because this is a very valuable piece of data, and this is going to be really useful for local public policy. So I'll stop at that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the comments. Let me address some of these. I think they're important ones. I think the first one is important, which thank you for bringing that up. I didn't get a chance to talk about it, about the PSLM and then the tax data. So PSLM, Barki Saab yesterday mentioned in his presentation as well, is that we know that these household surveys, which are randomized, they do very poorly in capturing the top of the income distribution, particularly because we have because it's the tail of the income, probabilistically it's hard to capture that, and also because of sort of political factors that you mentioned. You know, he was saying in his presentation, you know, do we really expect it going to go to high net worth individuals and be able to survey them for the PSLM? So that said, we also know that the tax data, I think we don't want to claim that this is representative of the population at all. I think we know that this is not representative of the population, but this is probably better representative of the high income individuals, right? So if we want to, what we're thinking about is having estimates from both PSLM and then having the tax data estimates as well, knowing that both of these data sets have these drawbacks. So if you want to get a full picture, we have to be using both of them, right? So the tax data is doing poorly at capturing the low income distribution, because a lot of them are, if they're below the threshold, they're not, they don't show up as taxpayers, but I think there's this important distinction between a tax filer and a taxpayer, right? So if you're below 60,000 and you're not filing taxes, it doesn't mean you're not a taxpayer. You don't have to pay tax, so that's fine. And most likely with presumptive taxes, you are paying taxes as well already, right? So the number of taxpayers there is a little misleading when we think about how many filers there are, particularly because the income threshold is so high. So I think that's what we want to do. We want to use the fact that the tax data is looking at the top of the income distribution and compare that to what we find with PSLM data, which is probably doing better at the bottom of it. And what's surprising is, I think, our results that even within this top of the income distribution, which is the tax data, we find very high levels of inequality, right? So if you say, let's look at a group of taxpayers, you would say, oh, these are the highest income individuals. So maybe within them, they're relatively similar, but even within them, we find that there's high levels of inequality. On pre-distribution, I think, as you mentioned, what we want to do is we want to look at these public spending projects and see where the income is being spent, right? So the idea is I showed you the maps, and we know where the income is being generated from by certain districts. If on a per capita basis, it's disproportionately being spent in areas that are have lower income, then that is some sort of spatial redistribution that's happening based on that, right? So even though the majority are happening in these metropolitan areas, but if in smaller districts that don't have a lot of population, in per capita terms, it's possible that these projects are achieving some sort of spatial redistribution. And so that falls into sort of the pre-distribution realm that we were talking about. So looking specifically at spending on sort of income and health and the public government is doing.
Yeah,
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah. Please go ahead.
One thing I'll mention also about the shifts in the income shares, they're roughly parallel shifts. They do highlight some levels of redistribution, right? So the idea is that if the top 1%, if their share of income is decreasing, that means the share of, if we draw a similar graph for the 99%, their share will be increasing, right? So if I showed you the graph for the top 50%, their share was decreasing when you look at net income. So the corresponding would be for the bottom 50%, when you look at net income, their share would be increasing, right? So it looks like it's just a sort of arithmetic sort of deduction over there, but it's actually looking at some measures of redistribution. And so I think perhaps visually it'll also be nice to show both of those together to show that if certain people are decreasing, then the others are increasing. On the tax data, we want to incorporate some measures of evasion, as you mentioned as well. So we're hoping that some of the some audit data that we have might help us in that. I think it's a valid point to say, is this a true income measure that's being reported in the tax data or not? And so hopefully getting some estimates of at least a ballpark figure of sort of how much evasion or how much true income may vary from reported income and tax data would be important. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
I think we have time for questions.
The audience, yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, thank you. Wonderful presentation, very provocative topic, and really fun to listen. I'm just wondering, do you have data on the sources of income that people are declaring in these returns? And my sort of suspicion is that a lot of this is declared as agricultural income, which is not taxed by the FBR. And I don't know if you have data on whether the tax is being paid on the agricultural income, which is paid to the provincial governments. So if you combine that with your actual tax payments data, so that might change some of the results that you're finding, right? So if they're already paying agricultural income tax, which is obviously very low, then it might change the effective tax rate that you are figuring out here. So that's that, and I think I'm also curious about, if you want to talk about, we can talk later on how you plan to use that audit data to sort of get to their actual income. I think that's super exciting. And of course, I think we'll look forward to what you find when you incorporate VAT data, because I think that's where the burden is on the low-income group people, and that will really change how you see these figures turn out. But again, a great presentation.
Thank you, Shevkan. I think that's an interesting point. My impression is that and I'll double check this, is that income that's not being taxed by the federal government is also not being as well reported in the tax data. There might be, that variable might be there, and I'll have to check. But even for example, like, because as I mentioned, for the fixed taxes as well, even those are, although the tax is being collected by the federal government, the corresponding sort of whatever revenue numbers are not being reported. So it's, but it's thank you for the comment. I'll definitely check on that. In terms of the audit data, I think we need to sort of think about, we know that with the audits there's sort of an algorithm that goes behind who gets audited as well. And so if we're trying to see if we can get some information on that, because ideally we would want to have sort of a random audit. In some years, I think that because of a certain sort of court stay order, there was like randomization in audits, but it wasn't. So we're trying to see if we can get some information about that process so that we can actually, ideally we would want to use that data to get like some measure across the income distribution of where evasion is happening. So we're saying, okay, people who are reporting in the 90th percentile, on average, how much are they evading versus people who are, something like along those lines.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. Want to know if the data you have access to, is it in the public domain, or and the data that I've been able to look at, which is in the public domain, was one which was available online at the FBR website, and it reports taxes basically for each individual or company. So that's something we have access to, but the data you're mentioning is something I've not seen, so presumably it's...
Yeah, no,
not-
unfortunately it's not publicly available. My co-authors have sort of a relationship with the FBR, so they've been able to get access to some of it.
All right.
What we have been able to do is with we do this verification with the publicly available tax disclosure data. So we actually see, because we have this, we see is it sort of matching and what we see in the tax disclosure data, and we do get it about a 95% match. So even for those years in which it's available, we are able to match and say, okay, verify that this is sort of the whole universe that we're getting. Yeah.
Okay. My question on the inequality in the top 1%. Now, why should it be of interest that there are people who are very rich and there are those who are obscenely rich? And inequality between them, why is that of interest? And so inequality generally, so you had something to say on that earlier.
Yeah.
But why is that inequality important for the top 1%?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think your point is well taken about when we do have such staggering inequality, does it really matter between the top 1 and even the 0.1? I think in this context, particularly with the income tax, because we know we're already only dealing with 10% of the population. And so if we're thinking about all our sort of federal, main portion of our revenue sort of generation needs are coming from the top 10%. So I think within that, it's interesting to look at particularly these very small groups as well. And also I think to look at what the maximum tax rate that we are achieving even for these very high net worth individuals is. So if from our initial estimates it's coming at about 18%, which is modest tax rate in terms of what the top income bracket is looking at. So I think there, perhaps more than what the level of inequality is maybe more interesting to look at what is how high the tax rate is in terms of how progressive it is that they're paying.
Just some clarification questions. Adding to what Rehman was saying, I'm wondering if you have some profile of the null filers. I expect them to be the majority of the people you have data for, at least. So, I mean, he was talking about agriculture income, but I suspect a lot of them will be self-employed as well. And so, so one is that. The other is if you can maybe, so I found the time trends also very interesting. So if you could contextualize those trends in terms of the tax regime at those times, so that would be helpful.
Yeah, so in terms of, sorry, just very quickly, I think the main change that we see in the tax regime that really sticks out is if you look at the normal. So there's one change that happens over here. So this is going between 2009 and 10. That's where tax rates change. And then this is, after that it's fairly similar. And that towards the end, you see in 2018, this is where the exemption threshold was really increased. I'm forgetting which specific government this was, but it was at that time, for 1 year, the exemption threshold was raised much further. And so over here, you see the effective tax rate up to the 99th percentile over here being 0. So there have been changes, and we were thinking that this is going to be creating maybe more variation than we saw, but then when we come to the sort of after-tax, these numbers, I think it was interesting to show that there wasn't that, like in terms of the movements we saw, it was fairly similar. So we haven't looked into that much detail. There are major changes in these levels that are happening, but it seems that overall the broad picture is roughly similar. Your first question, sorry.
Just if you have some information.
Oh, on the, yeah, so what we're doing, we do have, I think about, on the top of my head, I want to say about 40% are filing either below the threshold or zero income. So we're essentially anyone that's not reporting any income, we're dropping those people from this analysis to begin with. There are still a significant portion that are reporting income but zero tax. So they report income that falls below the income tax threshold cutoff. Those are included over here. Yeah.
Well, now your entire analysis is focused on people who are in the tax net. And since we know that we have a very, very large undocumented economy, as Haris was saying, that only 4% or so are paying taxes, and you think to rely on payment of VAT by people to account for the expenditure of those people who are not part of the direct tax regime. But then there is a lot of economic activity which is going on which no VAT is applied. So even very rich people spend their money inside Pakistan in ways where there is no indirect taxation, and then they also tend to spend money abroad. And then even the low-income quintiles, especially in the low-income quintiles, there is a lot of expenditure which happens where no indirect taxation is applicable. And of course, they are not part of the direct tax regime. So in the absence of accounting for all of this very large undocumented economy, how do you factor that into your estimation of the existence of inequality in Pakistan?
Yeah, it's a good point. I think what we hope that we'll be able to do is to at least get some measure of how of what we're missing, right? Of how large that the undocumented economy was. So some ideas that we had was that we have sort of some income data to try to see if we aggregate this, then sort of what percent of, say, the GDP numbers we're able to account for within those. If we make certain assumptions about what the overall, get sort of a ballpark figure of what we're missing. I think it would be great if we could also somehow try and have some distribution of that. Of course, it's don't have specific ideas on that as well. Right now, we're just thinking about an aggregate number of thinking about how much we're missing, like how much is the tax return data missing, which is income we know is being generated in the country, but it's just not showing up. So that we'll measure, but yeah, I think it would be great if we could somehow also add a distribution to that. We don't have any sort of concrete ideas on that, but I think as far as we can go right now is at least acknowledging and knowing what portion sort of we're missing, right? So I think there's within these data sets we will have this restriction that we don't have information available on those. Yeah. All right, thank you so much. I think we're out of time.
I've never worked on micro level data like Obeid has done, and I'm really lucky that I got a chance to be a discussant of his paper that gave me some time to set aside and actually look into micro-level details. So, but my work so far has mostly been on the cross-country data. But I believe that there is something every country can learn in terms of public policy when we fetch out the generalized patterns in cross-country data. So, okay, it's working. So basically, this paper is about stock ownership concentration and income inequality, how the ownership in the stock market translates into income inequality. It's in a very raw form. I didn't put in a lot of details. I was looking forward to this conference to actually get some feedback to see if I should actually work further on that, if it's really there's meat in the deal. So let me just give you a quick overview. I'll be quick. So the contemporary literature actually proposes exploitation rents that originate from monopolistic market structures, intellectual property, and other rents that give you an incentive to utilize the firm production channel to concentrate your wealth, right? And you can see it everywhere. I mean, you can see it in Pakistan as well. That in every product category, you will be seeing only 2 or 3 players which are having hefty margins, heavy profit margins, and they are actually taking it home, laughing all the way to the bank. So this means that people see an incentive to use the firm production channel, the economic production in the economy, to actually concentrate wealth. And this is the idea behind it. That's why the concentration in the stock market is something that is of concern to me as a researcher. So this wealth concentration that goes into the stock market is expected to translate into the national income inequality because of the dividends and the capital gains later down the road. So what we do, cross-country, and we go to the firm level. So for a panel of 73,560 firms in around 153 sub-industries all across the world, operating in 61 countries for 2000 to 2002. So basically, this century. We find evidence that, first of all, we find evidence that the firm's profit margin increases the chances of its concentration. And I'll get down to how we measure that. We further proceed to the country level aggregation, and we show that of these firms, when we aggregate it on a country level, then for 74 countries that we have data on, from 2002 to 2020, a growth in the capital to labor income ratio, separately only for concentrated ownership firms, leads to a growth in national income inequality. So there is a corporate capital to labor income ratio that can be calculated separately for the type of firms depending on the concentration class. So if the firm is highly concentrated, then their wealth is translated into income inequality. That is the main idea of this whole thing. So I'm going to get down to business, so how it is working out. So what is the conversation in literature so far? So there are 4 prominent channels that I could find. So there's a market concentration channel. Stiglitz has pointed it out. He's a political economist, but now the mainstream scientists, Berkey and Author, they are also actually reporting there is a lot of profit margins and market concentration happening in the corporate regime. So the political economists and capitalists, the neoliberal economists are actually getting on a consensus on that. And then there is a labor replacement with capital. That is a hot topic of today, labor decline. And there's a lot of literature on that. And people actually go to the extent of talking about a second machine age, where the whole labor is going to be replaced with machines. And that is something that everybody is kind of fearing as well. And then there's globalization, which is kind of exacerbating the whole thing. You know, you take the whole mechanical engine, which is replacing labor, and then you spread it the whole world, and the labor all around the world is being replaced, you know, through multinationals and all. So that is something that's not something that is in research papers. You can see it happening. And then, of course, part and parcel of the globalization and the negotiation power decline of labor is a decline in unionization rates and the workers' bargaining power. Because, I mean, of course, why am I going to listen to a union if I can hire someone in China or someone else in Bangladesh if the people in Pakistan are forming a union as a multinational? Just to give you some context. Right? So this is the conversation. How do we add value? What we try to do is that, I mean, as I've pointed out, that we try to say that there is an incentive to exploit this production channel through stock ownership concentration. So Stiglitz basically has done some wonderful work. He's, of course, a Nobel laureate. So, I mean, if you guys are aware of Piketty, he talks about the difference between the capital return and the economic growth, R minus G, and how this is leading by design to income inequality. But, and of course, he's talking about market forces who are doing it. But the political economist that Stiglitz is, he is actually reconciling the new classical theory with with what is happening in the market. So he actually talks about that it's not the capital share that is rising. He says that there is a wealth residual in the capital, and that wealth residual is a result of inefficient market structures. So a lot of profit margins, the capital is not increasing. If you see a lot of big companies, it's not that they are providing a lot of volume to the market and they are doing it very cheap and they are actually getting returns on the volume. They are actually getting returns on the margins. So it's not that the capital is increasing, it's actually the wealth residual that it is increasing. So that is something that is really fascinating, and his work is actually on a theoretical level. So I really was very fascinated. So I thought maybe there should be an empirical evidence on that. And it's not, so it's a very historical moment for the income inequality debate right now. Why? Because earlier, if you see, there was a consensus that economic efficiency and economic equality is a trade-off. But now, the mainstream economics is also accepting that higher inequality leads to exploitation and inefficient market structures, which is actually hindering economic growth. So mainstream economics is actually talking about income equality being a catalyst to economic growth. I mean, let's just give you a perspective. If all the wealth in the economy is concentrated in the top 1%, then where is the growth in the consumption coming from? Who is going to consume all the products that the firms are making? You need to have people in the lower 50% for example, or lower 40% who are going to go out in the market and then spend the money. I mean, who is going to buy all those products that the machines are making? So it's not a good recipe in the long run. Sustainable economic development is not possible with economic inequality. So that is something that the mainstream economics is also accepting. So it's not like the income inequality scholars are now on a normative table. They are actually now on the efficiency table or the positivist table. So this is a historical moment in terms of income inequality, and I'm really glad that people like Piketty and Stiglitz have actually brought this into the main focus. So I'm not going to, so yeah. Data and methodology, let's get down to business on that. So how do we do that? So income inequality growth, how we are doing, we are taking the natural logs of Gini index and the income shares of the 20 and 10% of the population to show growth. The profit margin growth that we use at the firm level, we take the difference of the 5th year lag and the 1st year lag of the natural log of firm's profit margin. So, we need to see that how the profit margin has traveled for the last 5 years, because it takes some time for people to realize, okay, there's something we can do in the market. So, and then of course, we are using lags here as well and here as well, and I'll come to how it addresses endogeneity. And then the firm capital, we are using the stock market value, and the labor income using the annual personnel expenses. And then we create a capital to labor income ratio, which is at the firm, country, and time level. So, for example, if there's an FMCG company that is operating in Pakistan, and there's an FMCG company that is operating in India, their subsidiaries or the operational presences are treated separately for every country. So this is what it is, right? So because, I mean, of course, because there's a lot of firm ownership concentration literature that talks about the life cycle of the firm. And I think the life cycle of the firm changes from country to country. So we did that on this. And then the concentration data. So I've used Osiris database for all the stocks information. So it has all worldwide information of all the stocks countries. So they have actually ownership data recorded. So what they do is they record an ownership class that goes from A+ to D. U is something that they don't have data on, and dash is something for institutions that are by default not owned by one person, like pension funds and all, So I mean, so that's why they have given it a week. They said that nobody owns more than 25% of an institutional ownership because it's a pension fund. And accordingly, if it's a firm, if no individual owns more than 25% of that firm, either directly or indirectly, Osiris has separately treated direct and indirect ownership, but for our paper, we have not done that because there is a lot of legal routes you can take to own a firm, right? So, but we are not concerned with that. As long as one person holds the wealth, regardless of the legal route they're taking, either they hold the stock directly or they hold it through a legal channel, it doesn't matter. The wealth is theirs. So we have actually summed up the concentration ownership classes into concentration levels. So I'll just make it simplified for you. If nobody owns more than 25% of a firm, either directly or indirectly, the concentration level is weak. If an individual in the firm owns between 25 to 50% of the firm, the concentration level is mild. If there is an individual in the firm who holds more than 50% of the firm, either directly or indirectly, the concentration level is strong. And there is a point I need to make about the 50% thing. After 50%, you get veto power, right? So you can actually control the whole firm. So this is an important point that will come later, so I want to mention it right now. So methodology, at the firm level, what we do is that we perform a panel ordered logic regression of a growth in firm profit margin and how it impacts the firm concentration level. So we look at if the increase in profit margin changes the chances of a firm to lie into a certain concentration class. And then we have at the country level, we execute a fixed effect regression to see if the capital to labor income ratio impacts income inequality. I have to be quick. So, okay, we can do the question answer session, but very quickly, this is standard. I mean, there's nothing. So we map the ordinal variable, which is weak, mild, and strong, to a ratio variable, which is basically classified into ranges. And then this is exactly how we work on ordinal information into ratio information. So then we execute behind the scenes, we execute regression, random effect regression, and the results are then classified on the basis of that. So I mean, this is standard methodology. I don't think I need to work on a lot of, I need to emphasize on that. For the fixed effect regression as well, the methodology is standard, but what I want to do is that I've already explained this ratio. But what I have done is that I have calculated this ratio separately for weak, mild, and strong companies. And the weights that I use to give importance to ratios at the firm level are their labor size, relative labor size. So the relative labor size, for example, if the labor size, if you can denote it by that number of employees, then all the firms with the same concentration level, you can add all the number of employees, and then you get a relative labor size for that weak concentration, and accordingly for mild and strong. So these are the weights, and they beautifully translate into aggregate level of a capital to labor income ratio, but I don't have the time to talk about it. And this is something, okay, I don't have time, okay. So, but then for each concentration level, we calculate separately the capital to labor income ratio for weak firms, the mild, and the strong. And then we execute a fixed effect regression separately for all at the concentration level. This is standard fixed effect methodology, and I can always answer questions if there are in terms of that. So what are the results that come down to that? So we can see that the profit margin growth leads to a positive increase in the income inequality, and all the control variables are showing their usual signs. But since profit margin growth is impacting concentration, and concentration is an ordinal variable, we cannot just use 0.06 to interpret anything, because it's an ordinal variable. So what we do is that we go for average marginal effects. We have done it for the main variable. So how to read is that what happens is that an increase in profit margin growth leads to a decrease in chances of a firm classifying in weak concentration, and this is offset by their chances less to mild and more to strong concentration. I hope this is clear. So once we are done with the firm level evidence of profit margin growth leading to concentration chances increasing, we go down to the country level aggregation. These are the results that are done separately for the capital to labor income ratio impacting income inequality for different concentration levels. So if you see the results, there is no impact on income inequality if the firm is weakly concentrated or mildly concentrated, but as long as the owner has a veto power, there is an increase in income inequality, right? So there is that. And then we have done some robustness tests that I can come into in the question answer sessions. The public policy, this is the last slide. Basically, you can read it all here, but the idea is that I have in mind is that labor replacement with capital is inevitable. Labor size is shrinking all over the world. It's a lost battle. So talking about giving labor something and then giving them, this is not going to work out. I think the real value lies in discouraging concentrated capital ownership and giving people more chances to own capital in the economy, right? So that they are participants in the growth in the economy instead of trying to create more workforce, which is not possible. And why fight technology? If it is giving us economic growth, why not make it more participated by, for example, giving everybody a share in the robot that is making the production? So this is the whole idea behind it. And thank you for listening. And this is all. These are the references.
have in this paper two facts that you presented using cross-country data and combining it with firm-level data. So the two facts really are that the growth in firms' profit margins is associated with an increase in the ownership of these firms, ownership concentration of stock owner concentration of these firms. And the second fact, which is more cross-country, is really about the capital labor income share being linked with income inequality. So there's a good data effort, and there are these two facts. I think going forward, this is clearly very preliminary work. You would need to think of this paper as, is it really going to just present two facts, or is it also going to be an explanation paper? And so you need to have some explanation as to these broad patterns. Now, this is becoming difficult with cross-country work. Cross-country work is becoming increasingly difficult to publish, but if you have a good explanation, and if you're providing some way of combining firm-level data, which you are, then there is obviously some mileage in this sort of work. Now, how could you do that? I think there are a couple of ways you could further move in that direction. One is that these firms are obviously stock market listed firms. And you mentioned a database, a Bureau One database. There's also Orbis database that provides information. Now that's not always very easy to access, but that provides you data for both firms that are listed as well as unlisted. I think the other thing that I would say is that there's World Bank Enterprise Survey data, which obviously you might not be able to use just the data on those firms, but in terms of the many explanatory factors like the level of stock market development or how much they invest, business environment, etc., you could construct indicators across countries. The other thing about the way you define concentration of firms is essentially around minority and majority shareholders in a way. Like, are you taking into account who is a minority shareholder or a majority shareholder?
No. It's actually seeing if there is one person who has 25%
of the shares. Now, in a lot of contexts, think about Morocco, Egypt, you have interlocking board memberships, right? So one person may own a small share of the firm, but they are part of the larger group of people, and their presence can be very critical. That is an important aspect. In terms of explanations, I think when you do include many indicators like the left-leaning, share, distributional preferences in a society are going to be very important, and the VDEM database provides the VDEM database, V-Dem database provides a lot of indicators on distributional preferences across countries at a high level of detail. One possible path forward, and I would encourage you to read that paper by Timothy Besley in American Economic, I think, AER Insights, and it looks at the sort of countries with better competition policies, right? And the paper looks at the share of tradables to non-tradables. So if there's less competition, there's a greater share in the non-tradable sector. And that obviously could have an impact on inequality. And their data is public as well, and it is around firms. So it does a bit like your paper kind of combines data for firms, across firms, leverages that variation and combines that with variation across countries. But I think competition in input and product markets is going to, and an output market is going to matter for inequality. So those issues you can account for, but clearly you need to add, some original novel explanation on top of these facts and make it more as a paper that presents facts, but is combined with some interesting explanation for these patterns. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. This is really fascinating feedback, and I was really actually looking forward to your feedback because to build on my paper, I actually had one question. Do you think that this political economy foundation that I'm coming from, like Stiglitz, that's not going to suffice as an explanation?
Probably not.
No. Okay.
I mean, it's an interesting fact you add to the explanation, but obviously you would need to think about some measures that vary across countries and perhaps also firms to then add on to an explanation.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure. So maybe we'll open up for Q&A. Anybody interested in thinking about?
It's a boring paper, I understand.
No, it's a lot of fun facts there, but they're not easy to digest, obviously. Please.
So, institutionally, like from the UAE's perspective, there has been a rule of, having 50% of the ownership of the local population, and the remainder, you can have 49%, but you can never be like a majority. Like you have the idea, you start a business, but you can't actually become the main holder. So I'm just wondering, like, how are you choosing these countries? Are you thinking about like I think this is going back to the original question, which is that institutionally things are so different across countries. One thing is to control for country fixed effects, but the other thing is that there are time-varying things that are also happening, right? So UAE last year changed this rule, right? So now I could just go in and own a firm without having a local partner. So that would obviously change the shape of this corporate landscape substantially. So I mean, it's a very, like, I'm coming from one data point and asking you.
That's all very well,
Yeah, so I'm just wondering, like, there are things that are constantly changing within the corporate world. I'm not an expert on these kind of data sets or the corporate part of, but the governance is changing. Shareholders are also expecting a lot more from the firms to, one is delivering just the profit, the other thing is delivering something sustainable, right? There is a need to have more sustainable outcomes. So I'm just, in a way, it's like expanding what you have, and I agree that you need some kind of stories to, like, keep people busy with their thoughts. Like, okay, maybe this is what's happening, but otherwise, I think that this is a good start, and you should not feel discouraged.
Thank you.
That's correct.
Thank you so much.
And also, I mean, one interesting aspect is the role of institutional investors.
Right.
So if you're thinking about UAE, but also other countries like Pakistan and Egypt, you have got big state-owned or semi-state-owned firms who have presence in the stock market. In our country, for example, a lot of the army-run firms or some of the state-backed firms. In Egypt, similarly, in UAE and other places, you have the big sovereign wealth funds investing in the stock market.
Okay.
What does that mean? So again, not to be discouraged, but to explore the data for explanations. I'm a great fan of just looking at the data and the patterns. Sometimes we rush to produce patterns and relationships, but just look at the data and also look at how stock markets vary, right? So there's a big literature out there on stock market development. What does it mean? Obviously, firms that are investing in the stock market are taking into account opportunities for making money elsewhere, outside the stock market. Now, you've clearly included indicators of financial sector development, but there are all sorts of interesting explanations that might give you leverage.
Yeah.
And then the paper can really be around an explanation, providing interesting facts, and then providing a new explanation.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Thank you so much for this feedback. Actually, it really opens my eyes. Let me tell you that.
No worries.
I mean, because I've looked at your paper which you are presenting. It's very detailed, and I look forward to that. And thank you so much for your feedback. Thank you.
Most
so much.
welcome. We'll continue our discussion afterwards.
Thank you so much. So nice of you.
Great. All right. So let me move to the paper, to my own paper, which is also a preliminary work. I've been doing some work on trade policy substitution in the Middle East, and so I thought, let's look at what the story is in Pakistan. Because we don't have a lot of time, I'm going to skip through some of the slides, and particularly the method part, but we'll come back to that in Q&A. When this conference started, Stefan started the conference by talking about elite capture in Pakistan. One of the points he made was that it's a very protectionist economy. It's very inward oriented. And some of the work by people like Naveed Hamid here and others have actually done a prior work on this subject as well. There's essentially four steps in my argument that I make in this paper. The first argument is that across a large number of developing countries, there has been quite a lot of trade liberalization since the 1980s, aided by the IMF World Bank programs, FTAs, the WTO, etc. So we see this pressure for many of the developing countries to liberalize. And that's common across a large range of developing countries and is supported by a lot of data. The other thing, and also it's a fact that we know, that this liberalization has been quite partial in the sense that it has been focused mainly on tariffs, and tariff reductions have been compensated through the introduction of other barriers. So we find a lot of trade policy substitution, countries reducing their tariffs, but slapping other kinds of trade policy instruments, such as non-tariff measures, such as other kinds of ad hoc trade policy instruments. The non-tariff measures are basically different types of policy regulations. You have sanitary, phytosanitary requirements, you have technical barriers to trade. Some of those are actually instituted to facilitate trade, because if the EU is importing your products, they want to make sure that their health, safety, environmental considerations are met. But they practically represent some kind of friction. So yes, a lot of liberalization, but partial liberalization in the sense that countries replace one type of trade barrier with other. The third aspect, which very few people have talked about, is that this has actually led to a lot of complexity. There's a lot more regulation that is coming in. There's a lot more effort for harmonization, and that adds to the complexity of those regulations, right? Which has made trade policy obfuscated. That's why the title of the paper is really Obfuscated Liberalization in Pakistan. Now we know from some of the work by Luigi Zingales and others that as complexity increases, as the complexity and size of regulation increases in a society, it becomes prone to political abuse. It can be used by vested interest groups. And so the fourth part of my argument is that complex trade policies tend to favor these well-entrenched interest groups by actually providing them disproportionately higher level of protection. And I'm going to provide you evidence on all these four dimensions in the context of Pakistan. I'm going to say that in the Pakistani context, we've had some effort at trade liberalization since 2001. It was focused mainly on tariffs. It was substituted by other kinds of trade barriers, which increased the complexity of our trade policy instruments, and ultimately it seems to have been captured by these vested interest groups. Now, why does this matter? What's the political logic of it? There's a very interesting paper in American Political Science Review by Kono that talks about, in the US context, the political logic of trade policy complexity. And of course, in this literature, which is usually around competitive democratic contexts, there's an argument that the voters like to have more open economy. And so once you have more complex trade instruments, they might be less costly in political terms, because if you're increasing tariffs, the voters may not like that. Whereas if you are just increasing the complexity through the use of non-tariff measures, they're hard to interpret. People don't know what does it exactly mean in terms of instruments. But a lot of this debate is really anchored in competitive democratic contexts where voters really care for welfare through preference for more open trade policies. There's actually very little literature on politics of trade policy in authoritarian regimes. There's a lot of literature in political science that compares political economy of trade policy between, how is it different from democracies, but very little on what happens within autocratic regimes. We do know that in many authoritarian regimes, or you call it hybrid regimes, or maybe you call them systems of authoritarian power sharing, such as the one that exists in Pakistan, voter preferences are less salient feature of trade policy formation. In fact, trade policy is more likely to be used for co-opting key business actors who are part of the authoritarian coalition. So at this present moment in Pakistan, it's becoming very clear that this distinction between democracy versus autocracy is a false binary. You have a system of authoritarian power sharing in which political parties are part of them, but you also have sort of key members of the business group. That's why whoever the authoritarian principle is, they will have very close relation with key business groups in society. Whichever government is in power, they tend to have their say in how economic matters are decided. So trade policy can actually be used as a way to what Mosquita describes as a way to distribute rents to key members of the authoritarian coalition. If you have a winning coalition, they want benefits to flow to them, right, within that authoritarian system. And so trade policy is a key means of ensuring that those rents flow to those actors. And the third aspect, which in this context is very important, is that these complex instruments, trade policy instruments, that are also less transparent, they're more useful in the face of external pressures to liberalize. So in many developing countries, when there's a pressure from outside to liberalize, you try and respond to that pressure by engaging in more shallow form of liberalization, just reduce the tariffs. And then you have a lot of leeway to compensate for that or to counteract that by increasing other kinds of trade policy instruments. So here's this policy context in Pakistan. We had a sort of a start of economic liberalization, 1990s, Pakistan joins WTO. But Romain Vexiarch has a database on when the uninterrupted liberalization really began. And it really began in 2001 with Musharraf coming to the saddle and really trying to implement fundamental structural reforms, and trade was one of that. But what happened afterwards is very interesting. We had a period when tariffs were liberalized sharply. Then you got into these political transitions where governments started facing current account deficits. So they were forced to compress imports. And one of the ways they would compress imports is to increase regulatory duties. These are additional duties. And the thing about regulatory duties is that they do not require parliamentary approval. If you are implementing, they're more ad hoc, they're more non-transparent, because tariffs have to go through the parliament. But these just require a cabinet nod. What you find here, which is really interesting, is that 2013, as I'm going to argue, is a watershed moment in trade policy in Pakistan. In fact, you could see post-2013, you've had a huge increase in current account deficit as well. What happens in 2001 is the PMLN, a more pro-business political party, comes to power. It signs an IMF extended fund facility. And normally the IMF doesn't focus much on trade, but in this particular context, there was a major package of reforms that revolved around trade. And in the wake of that, you saw a major wave of regulatory duties and an increase in non-tariff measures, and a further increase in 2016. And what I'm going to show is that this increase in these duties and non-tariff measures actually benefited sectors that were more exposed to politically connected groups. And in the end, I'm going to show, if you were to think about trade, overall trade protection, which is tariffs plus other measures, actually Pakistan went through a reversal of trade liberalization, which is a really interesting fact to consider. Okay, new IMF agreement. There are lots of quotes in my paper about the precise IMF descriptions about what you need to do, but basically there was a lot of emphasis on the simplification of tariff rates, reduce the bans. At that point in time, there were a lot of non-tariff barriers, which are different from measures, so they were to be removed. And the new non-tariff measures, which were these regulations that are, can facilitate it in principle. Those were introduced. But the important part of this program was also the phasing out of trade policy exemptions. So for the IGC, Saad Gulzar did a very good early paper on how Pakistan's large number of tariff lines are actually exposed to SROs, which are statutory regulatory orders. They're one of the key means to which rents are transferred to key sectors. That, you know, in this year, you will not have any duty, or your tariff rate will be very low. So the IMF wanted to phase that out. And in that, his Haqdar government, obviously, he's well known for his clever tricks. So he basically removed those SROs, but lumped them under one SRO. And so quite a lot of accounting was done there. But in the end, it meant that there was a wave of regulatory duties across different sectors of the economy. What I'm going to do in this paper is to compile a highly granular product level database, or about 6,000 products we have, on political connections. And typically the literature looks at organized versus unorganized sector. But in the Pakistani context, that doesn't capture a whole lot, because some organizations like the Sugar Mills Association or the auto or textile are obviously very powerful, and others, they may not be very powerful. But we'll clearly work with that measure. But we then compile original data on assets of parliamentarians, on other special interest groups, and I'm going to explain in a little while. What we then do is to build a very standard, hopefully most people would know here, a DID regression, which uses this 2013 shock to then explore how sectors that are politically exposed, and I'll give you different measures of political exposure, experience differential level of trade protection post 2013. And all the standard identification issues are relevant here about the exogeneity of the shock, the selection of these firms, and the selection issues I'm still working on, but basically I'm looking at a lot of these measures that are pre-period, but also controlling for the correlation of that with other kinds of trade protection. So I'll explain that. And then probably I won't have time to go into it, but the political economy of trade literature fits Grossman-Helpman models for equilibrium trade protection. But the results are in the paper. So there's a big literature out there, difficult to encapsulate in this short presentation, but there's obviously a lot of the literature on protection for sale. And that literature came in the United States, where there's a lot of lobbying for particular kinds of favors you want to receive. More recently, there's been a lot of literature on trade policy substitution. So Bowen and Tawar, for example, talk about India's 1991 reforms and how they led to, and again, an IMF program, and how reduction in tariffs were substituted for by increase in countervailing, the anti-dumping duties, which went to more organized sectors. And there's some work that I have been doing in this context. So this is all sector level data. We're just focusing on manufacturing sectors. There are 119 manufacturing subsectors. We have product level data, which we aggregate up to 119 sectors. I got access to this database from the World Bank, which compiled data on regulatory duties. Again, it's very detailed, product level, aggregating up to 119 sectors. There's also data, I mean, one of the great difficulties of working on trade in Pakistan is that you don't have data on trade elasticities, price elasticities, or ad valorem equivalents, but I managed to find 2 international databases that were compiled for the international sample and also has data for Pakistan. Lot of work on political connections. That's what really consumed us. Very quickly, what we did, we have firms with direct political connections, so these are parliamentarian assets, and you could see which firms they're owning. Turns out that doesn't matter a whole lot. Much of the action is not being done by parliamentarian firms, but actually other kinds of firms. We had stock market as well. The most important was this book. When I was growing up in the 1990s, I remember one of the first books I read was Who Owns Pakistan, which is a book by Shahidur Rehman, investigative journalist, and he documented the business stakes of about 42 or probably 45 families and their different holding companies and what they were producing. These were people who I would call they're really part of the authoritarian coalition. They're in every government. Doesn't matter which government is in power, they control various sectors. They've been beneficiaries of privatization as well. There are a lot of these procedures that we used. How do you really assign ISIC codes? How do you translate? You need to have data on products, what these firms are producing, what products they're producing, assigning them relevant codes as well. Now, I'm going to show you some basic patterns, and because I've only 4 or 3 minutes probably, I'm going to zoom through it and give you the big picture, and we can discuss them in Q&A. Okay, so these are import duties. These are regulatory duties plus additional customs duties. So we have something called tariffs. We added to that regulatory duties and also additional customs duties. These do not require parliamentary approval. And what you find is that, yes, they were introduced in 2008, but post-2013, there has been quite an uptick in these duties. And what you find is that all those sectors where those special interest groups, the Who Owns Pakistan list, actually ended up much higher, receiving much higher level of protection through these regulatory duties. And in fact, it didn't matter whether the PMLN government gave way to PTI government, because effectively they continued with the same policies. In fact, it increased. And that happens because in every government, you have the commerce minister or the economy minister, some of these ministers in the present government as well, you have members of these big business associations who protect their interests. So effectively, the story is really post-2003 increase in these regulatory duties. If you look at special interest groups more broadly, which is whether or not there is a Shahid or Rehman named family operating in a sector, and whether or not it's organized, you pretty much get the same pattern, that the increase in regulatory duties, which was supposedly used for import compression and to phase out SROs, actually ended up benefiting those sectors that were more politically exposed. And you could obviously do a standard DID regression model. You might be, you have to obviously control for sector level fixed effects. Some sectors are more prone to, of course, presence by politically connected actors. They might be prone to more protection, import protection, so on and so forth. We include industry into year fixed effects as well, and also flexibly control for initial level of protection, the ad valorem equivalent of NTMs, imports to GDP ratio, establishments, value added, etc. And I've got a bunch of other tables that do various permutations of this. The basic result is that if you were previously exposed to a special interest group, that sector would have received a differentially higher protection in the guise of import duties after 2013 relative to before and relative to unconnected. A very similar story in terms of these non-tariff measures. In 2013, was again a watershed moment, 2013 and 14, because half of the non-tariff measures that have been introduced throughout our history since 1967 were actually introduced in 2013 and 14. The product coverage increased. 3/4 of our product coverage of NTMs, how many products are covered by a non-tariff measure, actually happened in 2013-14 as well. And again, you find that this was a wave that affected most sectors, but it affected politically connected sectors a lot more than unconnected sectors. Can I steal 3 minutes extra, and I'll be quick. Similar pattern you find if you are politically exposed, you get higher level of non-tariff protection post 2013. Now, of course, we have looked at so far at import duties and at non-tariff measures. The question then becomes, what happens to overall level of trade protection? We know tariffs were declining in this period, and these other trade policy instruments were being introduced. What happened to the overall level of trade protection, which is tariffs, plus additional customs duties, plus import duties, plus ad valorem equivalents of NTM. So overall trade protection. This is just the AVEs showing that it's politically organized sectors had higher AVEs. So here is the plot which really captures the full decade. I want you to ignore this part because there's a lot of rationalization taking place. There's the 1998 nuclear test. If you look at Romain Bexyar's paper, he says 2001 was the time of when uninterrupted trade liberalization began. That was really bang at the start of the Musharraf period. What you find here is that overall trade protection, obviously at that time it was only tariffs, it declined for both firms. 2008, you see a little bit of difference, but really 2013, you find that overall trade protection began to increase because of the introduction of these additional instruments that I talked about. And by the end of the period, you could see that the connected sectors ended up getting a lot more protection. And in fact, if you were to compare to 2001, we are actually back to the same level of trade protection as before. In fact, for politically connected sectors, it's actually more, so they're getting even more rents. So this is really a story of reversal of trade liberalization in Pakistan, and a reversal of trade liberalization that is largely driven by these special interest groups. You can think about various different measures. I present in my paper many different ways of classifying political exposure. In this case, these are politically organized, which is you have a parliamentarian firm, you have a special interest group, you have an organized sector. All three categories are there. What would be the impact? And again, you find that this compared to 2001, we're really getting a lot more. And after 2013, we see this increase in overall trade protection, which continues through the PTI government, in fact becomes really significant at this time, which means it doesn't matter which government is in power, many of these interest groups will have their way anyway. Okay, you can do all sorts of sort of event study things, even on this overall trade protection measure, and you will find very similar results that in the pre-period, a lot of these coefficients are actually negative, statistically insignificant. Post 2013, there's a real jump in these coefficients, still insignificant, and they become a lot more statistically significant during the PTI government's period, 2018 onwards. You could look at different measures of political exposure and find similar effects, that there's something happening after 2013 that is really counteracting the earlier phase of trade liberalization. I also estimate, just for fun, what does it mean, what is the equilibrium level of tariff protection, trade protection, which would could then be explained through endogenously through politics, and the same usual tricks of the trade. The only innovation we do here, we use the synthetic control method to construct these instruments. And we have these tables. I'm going to skip those and straight to the concluding slide. What's the big story? The big story is that this is a story of reversal of trade liberalization in Pakistan, which started uninterrupted in 2001. It was focused more on tariff liberalization, and that tariff liberalization was followed by a stream of non-transparent and discretionary instruments that effectively made trade policy more complex. We had this tax paper, that there again the story is of complexity, right? And that complexity is really an artifact of the political capture of the system. We've shown that this trade policy, this obfuscated liberalization, benefited politically exposed sectors. And I've shown that these politically exposed sectors are less about parliamentarians. They're more about special interest groups who will have their way whichever government is in power, because those special interest groups are part of what I call the system of authoritarian power sharing. They're part of the authoritarian winning coalition. Obviously, I've shown you the overall trade protection, but the effective protection would actually be higher, because if you were to think about sales and federal excise taxes, they are add-on to these, and there's a cascading tariff structure, which further makes it complicated. And there's a lot of recent World Bank work that talks about how high import protection effectively acts as a tax on exports, because it means by affording greater protection to domestic industry, you're incentivizing them to produce for the domestic markets. And so for fun, I looked at one sector. I found a report from the State Bank of Pakistan that talked about the absence of Pakistan in the global garment value chain and the role of man-made fibers, the synthetic fibers, which is code 2430. And it talks about Bangladesh, Vietnam, many countries who are actually importing man-made fibers, both final product but also raw materials, whereas Pakistan has a high import protection regime that is preventing the development of that kind of a value chain. So I looked at that sector alone, which is synthetics or man-made fibers. And again, you find a very interesting story. Even the State Bank report just focuses on tariffs. So tariffs are clearly coming down, right? So they're just 10%. Now, even these 10% is very high because in Bangladesh it's 0%, in Vietnam it's 0%, and so on and so forth. But what you find here is interesting is that the overall effective protection is actually much higher because you add these regulatory duties and non-tariff measures, which makes it, the effective protection is probably close to 25, 26%. And so the numbers that I'm giving you and the patterns I'm providing have real implications for thinking about productivity of our sector and trade protection and so forth. So I'll end there, and sorry for taking more time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Adeel, for that paper and the presentation. It was a pleasure to read the paper and then also see the presentation today. So let me start off just by talking about the contribution, which I think is very important in, as Dr. Malik was mentioning, about getting into weeds of some of these policies to understand if they are failing, sort of where they are failing. So if trade liberalization was the goal, and then at first glance those targets were achieved to some extent, as we can see over here in terms of decreasing tariffs, why is it that liberalization broadly was not achieved? And then it's easy to say that it wasn't, trade liberalization was not successful, but to sort of understand the sort of political economy reasons of who were, there were still, of course, winners in the situation, sort of who were those winners. So I think in that sense, it's an important contribution. I'll also add that I think it's a rather mammoth data effort to combine trade sources that, trade data sources that often don't talk well with each other, and then to layer onto that this very important political connections data of work of looking into identifying sectors that are politically connected across various measures, and that has generated some very sort of interesting results. I'll talk about a couple of comments. One thing related to what we were mentioning about sort of complexity, and I think the link between some of the tax work and this trade work, which is specifically about this 2013 time period where the switch happens, and we see, as Dr. Malik was saying, part of it driven externally by IMF programs and their insistence on certain levels of trade liberalization that should be achieved, and a local sort of response to that. And I think it's a nice analogy that to some of the work in taxes as well, where we have sort of targets on tax to GDP that need to be achieved, and those are brought in, and then we have sort of a local response to how they're achieved. And often is the case is that complexity is a way to sort of bypass these regulations. In terms of the this timeline of 2013, I think it'll be interesting if you could, you mentioned this briefly, but whether or not the identity of the party coming into power at that time was relevant, or whether it was more primarily just being driven by the MF at that point, because we do see, as you've seen in the data, that each successive change in political party brings in a new wave of politically connected individuals benefiting from these non-trade measures. The second part of my comments is about thinking about whether we can also see what these results, the impact have been in terms of real value terms in some of these trade outcomes. So I think the results that you've shown sort of very clearly document this difference between the politically connected and unconnected sectors in the economy. I think to get a sort of a next step, which would be very interesting, is if we could somehow quantify sort of which sectors those are, how large their share are, to sort of get a sort of back of the envelope calculation of in terms of the overall value that's being generated or lost because of these connections, what that is. So again, thinking about how we can perhaps map on for each of these individual subsectors sort of what portion of imports that they're representing overall. Similarly, I was thinking on political connections that I think it might be, if you want to go into more detail here, interesting to look at more distinctions within political connections within sectors. My thought was that being a politically connected firm where you have that individual firm has large market power, or that sector is categorized by very low levels of competition, may be very different than being politically connected in a sector where there are sort of more competitors. In terms of political connections being beneficial for those parties, that makes sense. But I think, again, linking this back to this idea of can we think about more of the overall value in terms of what the trade is being generated. So yeah, I think those are just some of my comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Mohammed.
So first of all, I think thank you very much for this presentation. It's probably one of my best presentations in the company. So really happy to hear. So I think my main question is just about basically, so you have this thing happening in 2013. So why exactly 2013, right? Like, what's really the shock in 2013 that basically enables these interest groups to sort of now use the trade liberalization policy for their benefit? Because, I mean, these interest groups, as you mentioned, they've been there throughout all of the governments. They've been with the Sharifs, with the PTI, and everywhere. IMF programs have been there, like, I think, for the past 20 years and so on. And similarly, this is not the first time the Sharifs were coming to power, right? They came to power even before 2000. So what's really in 2013 that you should see this? And also, like, when there was this like trend going down in trade liberalization, right? Why don't you see that like these interest groups are able to slow down that trade, like, so why don't these interest groups are able to like slow down the trade liberalization for their particular sectors, right? So why is it the trend quite the same for both these and other groups? And I mean, I'm also like just sort of brainstorming, there might be some international productivity shock that sort of affect in 2013 that is basically affecting these particular sectors. And now then there is a realization in the government that we want to protect these sectors, and these sectors just tend to be the ones where the political families are sort of dominated. So I think that the 2013 point is sort of something that I can't like grapple with fully.
Okay, great. Could we collect, perhaps if you, yes. Maybe we'll start with that. With
So
you.
can I, okay.
Yes.
So I think I quite like the presentation and the work, but I have one question which is not coming from me as a political economist. I do trade. So I was just wondering, I mean, when you put these kind of protections, it's also equally harmful for these firms if you're using certain inputs that are also coming from, you know, the tariff would make it more costly. So, you know, we use input-output matrices to try and understand that aspect. So I mean, it would be nice to see what is happening to these politically advantaged group in terms of their profits, or like economically, are they also gaining, or they are thinking that this is a good policy for them, but actually are mistaken. I'm kind of, I want to know who is advising them that this is the right way to go, and ask IMF or motivate IMF to put these non-tariff kind of measures. But I'm not sure if they actually understood that economically it may be hurting them, right? So I would like to know if that actually translates into economic value or, you know, lack of value thereof. Thank you.
Thank you, Adeel. Very, very interesting piece of work. So the big picture, I think it kind of like fits in with Stefan's narrative of like there is a coalition, and that is kind of like every policy becomes like subversive and endogenous to that coalition. So then it will be the trade policy, higher education policy, or monetary policy. So whatever we look at, it will revert to the same kind of like outcomes as you have kind of like illustrated in the case of trade policy. So my question is like how similar it is in terms of like how endogenized it is within this framework of elite capture. then I think there are a couple of interesting data points. Like in 2001, which is the most autocratic of the coalition, you are saying that it is at the bottom of like the protectionist years. And then there is a mean reversion kind of like back to where it is. So what is the equilibrium for Pakistan? Where do we stand? And how does it compare with India? Like in the 1990s, like you have mentioned the 1991 reform, they went to the IMF for the first time. They were able to break that coalition structurally. But Musharraf, having all the wherewithal to do that in 2001, failed to do it. So where is the disconnect in those two trajectories? Thank you.
Great question.
I think it was interesting, the analysis which is done in terms of the trade barriers. But couple of things which are a backdrop is like when you say 1995, so actually it is the World Trade Organization Foundation. So that is something which is a bigger picture. One. Two, in Pakistan, 90s was actually post Afghan war and post Zia. A liberalization, and especially in energy, in telecom sector, they were opening up and capital inflow, so they needed a policy in that manner, oil and gas. So this is all I'm talking in real terms. So there was objective conditions which actually suited that. So we looked at WTO, we look Afghan war going, Russia falling, and all these things. What you say post, like then in 2001 Musharraf era and 13, isn't it very natural that any capital economy in shadow is some sort of democracy is driven by the major business groups, and the business groups actually accumulate wealth, concentrated to build enterprise, and those enterprise actually make a national economy which grows and drives. Is it something which is negative for the growth, or it is very traditional? So how do you translate it in terms of your results of this study? So one thing is the study you're doing, that's wonderful. But how it is going to be translated in terms of political drivers and political effects in terms of the national growth? Because you have touched it with the productivity. So is it a productive or it is a counterproductive? And is it a capture going to be productive at a certain stage and then become unproductive? These are the parameters, the variables I would like you to touch. Thank you.
Thank you, Adeel. So first of all, let me preface this by saying that your story is the one that I believe, but I want to put forward the Isaac Dar defense, potentially, which would be that the politically powerful tend to also be rich, and that in a country with poor capital markets and one that genuinely believes in an import substitution model, that complexity may be allowing the pursuit of our national economic model for growth rather than be a capture story. And so can we think of differential measures of sort of political power holding capital requirements constant, or rather sort of industries where capital requirements might be different, and we are seeing that it is because of that political closeness to the government that we are getting protection, and not the fact of the lumpiness of investments that are required. So for example, I think about the car manufacturing, the car assembly industry, the mobile manufacturing and policy, which are two of the major ones that came through in this time period. And both are ones that require large factories, right? And so maybe it's not that those people are politically connected, but that they have, that they're the holders of large amounts of capital that allows us to unlock those assembly plants. I'd like to reiterate what other people have said on profitability, thinking through the profitability at a micro level for these firms. Has it been a good strategy or not? That would add something to the story. And I wonder if there's a way to get more granular about the distinction between 2013 and 2018. So while I agree that broadly speaking, these are the groups that are part of what you call the sort of authoritarian coalition that rules. Surely there are differences within sort of the coalitions that are formed between PTI and and PMLN, and therefore, did we see differential tariffs going into industries that are more PMLN heavy or more PTI heavy in those two different time periods? Thank you.
Okay, good. Adi, and then maybe two more, and then I should finish.
Your paper is
I think sort of these two questions are important questions, which are, so the big story, I guess you're trying to give us a story about Grossman and Helpman, which would be special interest groups form and then they capture a trade policy. But is it special interest groups driving it, or is it policy driving special interest groups? I think that kind of causal connection, so I mean, one way to kind of another alternative story is you want to raise revenues, you decide that these are lucrative firms which are generating rents, and you start to basically put higher tariffs. We do know that, you know, tariffs as a source of revenue has become very important. We have one of the highest rates of revenue collections from tariffs. So I think that would be important. I think like jo ye keh rahe the, one framing suggestion would be that a big part of the macro story of the period you're telling is that exports to GDP ratios actually collapses and is stagnant. So I think just stating that up front may be mooring this in the real question that were there real effects, although you're not showing the linkages, but that is important. I mean, I had one concern, which is when you look at the event study results that are there, actually the differential effects start to happen in 2018.
That's right.
Is it because you have very little power? I mean, what's going on? Because in that sense, 2013 is not when the differential effects actually show up. Whereas you're saying that's the trigger point. And that would be kind of interesting to unpack.
These are fascinating work. My name is Imran. Just a very side comment. I guess all countries favor certain industries and at various times. For example, if you look at US, electric car industry has enjoyed a lot of tax breaks, incentives, whatever have you, and now it's happening in semiconductors also lately. So that's just an observation, but then a comment, and that is that you know, your comment about SROs and our reliance on SROs to favor certain industries or mechanisms at certain times. Just curious if you have any observations on the following statement. Is that the result of a weak long-term trade and industrial policy and lack of state capacity? And since you don't have that, maybe SROs are a mechanism that you have put in place to compensate for that.
Yeah, thank you. Final question, and then we'll just close because we are eating into lunchtime.
Thank you, Adeel Saab. One kind of question, maybe out of left field. What's the relationship of special interest groups to foreign capital? Because there's one story where foreign capital prefers low tariff rates, but there's another one where they're happy with high tariff rates because that enables them to exploit domestic markets.
Okay.
With branch plants, et cetera.
So really fascinating set of questions, and in the interest of time, I'll be brief. Some questions could be taken together. Thank you for your comments, Obeid, and it kind of links with Ali's comments as well. I mean, there's the tax to GDP ratio. The fiscal side is a key part of this story, Ali, because you know, the IMF program comes in, they want trade reforms, and they also want some fiscal targets to be met. And we know that in the 2000s, 2013 onwards, in that period, trade policy was being used as a way to generate revenues. And of course, there's a big industry there. You can tax them, but at the same time, it's also incentive compatible with them in a way because it gives them more protection. I think the point about 2013 as a general shock is important, and also the 2018 one. Now, the 2013, the identity of the party I need to look at in more detail, in the sense that you know, some of these, the precise members of these coalition might differ. And so some of those effects could be driven by that. But ultimately, you also have, these changes take a little bit of time to come through. The coefficients, which I think for those plots, which is really important, is that the coefficients really jump. You are really a negative coefficient, and then it jumps to 1.4, 1.5. Not significant, but then becomes significant during the PTI period. So there's a lot more work to be done there. There's also a question about what does it mean in terms of those firms, what is the value that is lost, the overall loss to economy. That would require a lot more firm level work that I plan to do. Also, input tariffs and intermediate inputs. That sort of work needs to be in my extension. I'm planning to do that. There is, I think, Mohammed, your point about the shock in 2013 is again well taken. It is, in a way, if you look at what was happening in 2013, a lot of it was really externally driven. So the IMF reports, if you read in detail, and I also interviewed the 2 or 3 IMF resident representatives, one before and one after, and the one who was there in 2013, he also agreed that at that time there was a lot of push towards trade, and particularly SROs. But they were not really looking at many of these compensatory measures. In terms of, Salman, it's a deeper question about how is this endogenized, right? And you're absolutely right, during the Musharraf period, that's also an authoritarian system. I think one needs to think more clearly about sometimes what other rents are available. If the economy is growing, if there are other rents to gain, you may not need that much protection. It's when the size of the market is shrinking, when the size of the rent is shrinking, you would ask for more protection. And that's what really happened in Lebanon as well. And there's also that sense, I mean, even these trade liberalization years were really 3 or 4 years. 2006, already things were beginning, the process of mean reversion had started. But again, it requires a bit more thinking precisely on those sorts of questions. Now, in terms of, Ali, I've kind of responded that we need to think about the precise standing of these in different coalitions, but my sense is I could look in more detail in what those sectors are. But some of those sectors which actually got a lot more protection could have better linkage with PTI. Now, there were 2 waves of import duties. One was 2013, the other was 2016, which is just before. Again, it will take a bit of time for their effect to be prevalent. The point on large capital sectors is taken. And Noman, in terms of foreign capital, I doubt that would be a big part of the story. Levels of foreign direct investment, particularly in manufacturing, are generally quite weak. But really thankful for all the comments, and I've enjoyed the conference immensely. And thank you to Ali, Farah, and everyone for organizing a fabulous conference.
Thank you.